Welcome everybody to this webinar hosted by the Australian National University's Malaysia Institute and the Jeffrey Cheah Institute for Southeast Asia, based in KL. Today's webinar, as you all know, is to be discussed, elaborated and discussed by Professor James Chin from University of Tasmania. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of the land on which the Australian National University is built, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. As you all know, there's been a remarkable sequence of events and developments that have happened across Malaysia this year, and we've not even finished with 2020 just yet. Aside from the crisis of the pandemic, as you know, there was a dramatic change of federal government back in February. And more recently, after snap polls in Sabah State as well. Professor James Chin has very kindly agreed to give this webinar titled The Borneo Dilemma, which hopefully will enable us to discuss and explore some of these issues that are going forward, going to be part of the soon expected Sarawak state polls, state elections, possibly in the next 6 months, as well as what has happened in 2020 so far. And obviously it tackles the vexed federal-state relationships as well, and what has recently been happening in Sabah. Today, we're also going to be joined by at least two people, discussants who are participating in this. Hopefully more. Those of you who are going to be participating in Q&A. We have the senior Sabah State MP or Assembly person, Jannie Lasimbang, who was until recently the Assistant Minister in the Warisan-led government in Sabah. She'll join us shortly while she exits another event. And also a Sarawak youth activist and a former aide to the current Perikatan National Minister, Nancy Shukri, Trinity, Bungan, Tajang, who is in Kuching. As you all know, I won't go and read the description that was in the webinar, but basically there's been a great deal of discussion and debate about the growing restlessness in East Malaysia over the 1963 Malaysia Agreement, or otherwise known as MA63, and how the recent Sabah election results and the upcoming Sarawak state elections, and how that's all going to affect federal-state relations, and whether the Muhyiddin government, which remains apparently in a very fragile condition, facing a serious federal budget vote this next 2 weeks, how they're going to address these historical grievances and perhaps even survive its own term. To begin with, I think it'd be good to just play you these two clips of Jannie Lasimbang talking about what it means in terms MA63 and the federal state issues for Sabah State and what has happened there recently. And we'll start with what first-time voter Trinity Bungan Tajang will explain about what this MA63 issue means or not to her generation, and to what some of these issues are in the face of this terrible pandemic. So I'll start with Trinity.
That was actually a big topic among the Sarawakian youths going along. Yeah, we were quite worried about that part, the Sarawak's autonomy foremost. A lot of people were talking about it, especially since one of the PH manifesto was to return 20% oil royalty to Sarawak, but we didn't really see that much of that. But as soon as PN stepped in, they kind of addressed the issue almost immediately within the first year. So that part we have to applaud them for. We have to really give credit to them for that. PN did come in while we're in the middle of a pandemic, whereas PH had been here for about a year and a half, and PN had only been here for a few months. So it's a bit too early to compare, based on my opinion. I feel like I'll be giving an unfair judgment on that. But for the coming elections, I am excited, and I'm really hoping that Sarawak government will be pressing more for issues regarding Malaysian Agreement 1963, MA63, like really, really pushing for it and seeing how far we can take this with this new government. I do have faith, and I am very excited to see how things will go, especially as a first-time voter. I want to see what changes, even though my people in my age range the number is quite insignificant because it's only 18 to 21. So I do want to see what changes can be brought and what issues can be raised by us and how the government will be tackling them.
Thanks, Trinity, for some of those views. Hopefully we'll manage to have a look through them with Professor Chin. And now this is a clip of a discussion we had over the weekend with Jannie Lasimbang, who will also join us in a live discussion.
Surprisingly, MA63 among communities is not one of the big issues. Even during the election, it was not one of the issue that I think made Warisan Plus lose also. It was more actually the illegal immigrants, and as I said, that was used, or that was highlighted as part of the sentiment building, the negative sentiment. Now, with the pandemic, the MA63 have been discussed more recently. Partly one, there's a Sabah Sarawak minister, a position at the federal government that was created. But unfortunately, that doesn't seem to have shown good, something that has led to something positive, because now that the discussion is hot at the parliament on our budget 2021, it is not showing that Sabah has been accorded more allocation, and so that has come because, mind you, the discussion is still more focused on money and control rather than real autonomy. And this is something that actually has been pursued by the Warisan Plus together with the Pakatan Harapan, where 17 out of the 21 issues were discussed. Key issues like, the Petroleum Act, the royalty has not been discussed, and these were the key things that is being pursued, but has not borne fruit as far as Sabah and Sarawak is concerned. So I think, especially during the pandemic now, it's again the bigger issue that's coming out is the illegal immigrants, talking about health and support for them, as well as this proposal that they should be given, temporary pass for workers here, and people. The government is becoming, coming under fire because they're saying the workers in Sabah, especially Sabahan and Sarawakians who are looking for jobs, are not there. So why are you instead giving pass for or temporary pass for those who are migrants coming to Sabah. I think Sabah and right now the discussion of MA63, as I said, is always about only the funds. The whole discussion about being more autonomous in terms of your decision, how you, the discussion with the state federal discussion, how autonomy should be looked at, and also education for the communities and how autonomous an autonomous region should be, has never been brought out. So there is always a limitation in terms of the understanding of autonomy as far as Sabah and Sarawak is concerned. Even less in Sabah, because it's always seen as, okay, how much money do you want? Is it the 20% royalty or 5%? And then also the 40% that should be increased, a demand for us. And we can see from Sabah, after the GRS government took over, the health and the education ministry that was set up was already scrapped. The ministry that I used to work, the Law and Native Affairs, which is something very important, especially when you think about the Batu Sumpah in Keningau. These were all issues that were very important to people on the ground. But when the GRS government came in, they just did away with it, saying, okay, we already have a federal ministry. Exactly what the move by Warisan Plus was doing was to actually try and be able to take control, to be able to make these important issues more meaningful in Sabah. But now we are back to discussing about, are we going to get more money for development, and so on. So, the discussion has again become skewed into just development and money issues.
Thanks, Jannie Lasimbang. And before that, you heard Trinity, Bungan, Tajang. That was many, many issues I think we can definitely go on to discuss. Now I think it's for us to welcome Professor James Chin to help us explore all these issues that we are now going to go through about Sabah and Sarawak, and to even help many Malayans or those in the peninsula deepen our understanding in trying to make the nation whole. For those of you who haven't met James, as you know, Professor James Chin is Professor of Asian Studies and the inaugural Director of the Asia Institute at the University of Tasmania, where he joins us today. He's also a Senior Fellow, Jeffrey Cheah Institute on Southeast Asia in Malaysia, and was previously a Senior Visiting Research Fellow at ISIS in Singapore, and the head of the School of Arts and Social Sciences at Monash University. Prior to an academic career, James worked as a journalist in Malaysia and Singapore. He's a leading commentator on Malaysian politics and has published extensively on Malaysia and the surrounding region, and has appeared on CNN, BBC, CNBC, Bloomberg TV, and Channel News Asia, talking about developments in Southeast Asia. And as you know, his comments are often reported in the New York Times, the FT, the Wall Street Journal, and other leading publications. Without any further ado, James, welcome. You've got the floor, and hopefully we can try and start a conversation with your first 15 minutes. James.
Thank you very much, Kean. I hope all of you can see my screen with the PowerPoint. So what I'd like to do today is basically go through with you several key items and cover some of the issues that was raised by the first two speakers. I'll say something about the Sabah results, then I'll talk about the upcoming Sarawak elections, then I'll talk about the implications for federal-state relations, and more importantly, the last two parts, which is I'll talk about the current options in terms of Sabah and Sarawak for the Muhyiddin administration. Then I'll try to answer the key issue. What really is MS63? Are we really going back to the future? So in terms of the Sabah results, one of the really interesting things and one of the things that was underreported in the media was that this was a very strange state election. It is strange because it wasn't really a contest between Shafie Abdel representing Warisan Pakatan Harapan versus the Barisan Nasional Sabah. It was really Shafie Abdel versus Muhyiddin. If you were in Sabah during the campaign period, you'll see that all the posters promoting Perikatan Nasional or GRS, they actually do not have the picture of the local candidates. They have pictures of Muhyiddin all over the place. Part of the reason, as many of you know, was that Sabah Barisan Nasional and Perikatan could not agree on the chief ministerial candidate if they win. So that's the reason why they had to cobble together a coalition called GRS at the very last minute. The second important point is that the results were actually very, very close. A lot of people thought that Warisan would win quite handsomely, but in fact they did not. The differential between Warisan and GRS was only less than 2,000 votes. But in terms of the actual assemblymen elected, Warisan end up with only 32, while GRS end up with 38. So obviously, they formed a new government. What was really important in terms of the results was that the Kedasan Dusun vote, the indigenous vote was split. It was very clear that the interiors of Sabah, where most of the Kedasan Dusun voters are located, most of them decided to vote against Warisan PH. Part of the problem is that, interestingly enough, Sabah BN and GRS was very, very successful in portraying Warisan as a PTI party. In other words, Warisan was actually promoting the illegal immigrants into Sabah. And also, of course, like all previous elections in Sabah, money played a very important role, especially the night before polling and the early morning polling when a lot of money was actually given out. In fact, I've been told that several millions was shifted at the very last minute in order to defeat one particular party, because that party defected during the last election and the person paying the money wanted to teach that party a lesson. I think in terms of the big winners from the elections, I think DAP did very well. I think they consolidated the urban Chinese support. So that's the reason why, as a punishment, there's no ethnic Chinese in the Sabah State Cabinet. And interestingly enough, the second big winner in this election turned out to be STAR. STAR was basically a small mosquito party, and STAR was widely seen in Sabah as the party that sort of pushed for MS63 the hardest. Because the leader of STAR is a guy called Jeffrey Katingan, and he's been fighting for Sabah's autonomy for the last 20 years. As YB Lasimbang has mentioned, MS63 was brought up by all the candidates, brought up by all the sides, whether you're the government or the opposition, all of them claim to be champions of MS63, but somehow it wasn't enough to help them win. So one of the interesting things about the Sabah election is that although anti-federal sentiments was quite strong this time around, it was not able to overcome money politics and big man politics. The end result for Sabah really is that Muhyiddin's position as the Prime Minister has been strongly strengthened. He can show that he basically, through the Sabah election, he shows that he can lead an election, even the election in East Malaysia, and he can win big. He was in such a powerful position that he even forced UMNO to give up the Chief Minister's post. As many of you know, Sabah UMNO wanted the Chief Minister's post badly, but in the end, they couldn't get it. So in the end, the compromise was that Bung Mokhtar, the leader of Sabah UMNO, was allowed to choose his own position in the Sabah State Cabinet. At the federal level, there's been no real changes to Parliament because this was a state elections. But the results show quite clearly that the Project IEC that was started in the late 1980s succeeded again in stopping the Kedasan Dusun and the Chinese coming together in order to vote out the Barisan Nasional and Perikatan Nasional. I'll just quickly move to the upcoming Sarawak state election. This is the first election for GPS and its leader Abad Johari, and basically he is using the same formula the very, very successful formula under the old Barisan Nasional that was used in 2016. And this formula was basically started by Adnan Satem, the previous chief minister, and it's basically based on the philosophy of Sarawak for Sarawakians and Sarawak first. Now, in some ways, this philosophy is even stronger than MS63. Because recently in the Sarawak State Assembly, they actually passed a constitutional amendment to stop non-Sarawakians from actually getting elected into the Dewan Undangan Negeri. I do not know of any other state in Malaysia that has a similar amendment. They're planning to start their own education system. So the Sarawak state government is actually paying for the building of several international schools in Sarawak that will offer English as the medium of education. They've started their own TV station, and they've even rented a channel on Astro to show TV Sarawak, and they've also started their own oil and gas company called Petros. So in some ways, they're even stronger in terms of not only asking for autonomy, but sort of building all the institutions of a state within a state. Now, when it comes to the opposition, my argument is that the opposition is currently very, very weak. They're highly, highly fragmented. And the two strongest in the opposition is probably the DAP, the Chinese-based party, and Parti Sarawak Bersatu, PSB. But unfortunately, among the opposition in Sarawak, there is issue of trust. Because many of the people in the opposition now actually came from the old Sarawak Barisan Nasional. So for example, the leader of PSB is a former senior minister called Wong Sun Ko, and he's managed to get several other YBs from the old Sarawak PKR to move into his party as well. So therefore, this creates a lot of bad feelings and bad sentiments among the opposition parties. PKR Sarawak, which was previously led by Barubian, who shifted to PSB, is now under new leadership, Larry Singh. And again, there is a question over whether he can actually do anything beyond Kapit area. My take is that the coming Sarawak state election, some of the key issues will be, of course, MS63, as we discussed, and also the issue of Daikism. In other words, what role should Dayak play in the Sarawak political system? And here, basically, when you talk about Daikism, you talk about two core issues. One is whether they're going to elect a Dayak to be the chief minister again. This is something that's very, very emotional for the Dayak community in Sarawak. They felt that being the largest community in Sarawak, they should really get a shot to being the chief minister. The first two chief ministers of Sarawak were both Dayak Ibans, but ever since they lost in 1970, they've not been able to put another Dayak candidate up to be the chief minister. The other big issue under Daikism, of course, is the NCR land or native land titles. Again, this has been going on for many, many years. Again, it's unresolved issues. But as I mentioned earlier, Abang Jo has been quite successful in this idea that he's a much stronger nationalist, even stronger than MS63, and he's managed to get some key concessions from the federal government. So, for example, he has managed to get the federal government under Muhyiddin to get Petronas to accept the sales tax from Sarawak. So Petronas essentially had to cough up about 3 billion ringgit to pay the sales tax to Sarawak, when in fact Petronas did not want to do it in the first place. In fact, Petronas actually hired several high-powered lawyers to fight the case, but they were told by Muhyiddin after the change of government not to pursue the case and basically give in to Sarawak's demands. One of the interesting things that will come out, and I predict that the opposition will not be using one of its biggest targets. As many of you know, one of the key reasons why the opposition was successful in 2011 was they targeted the then Sarawak Chief Minister Taib Mahmud. But in this case, or in this coming state election, I suspect the opposition, even though they know that Taib's name is still very, very negative in the voters, they will not be using his name, neither will they be targeting him. Part of the reason is because I think the opposition is afraid of the Sedition Act. They are afraid that if they target Taib Mahmud, they'll be charged under the Sedition Act. The other big advantage GP has over the opposition, of course, is that with the 3 billion payout by Petronas, they will have plenty of money to spend in the elections. Sarawak is a huge state. In fact, if you combine Sabah and Sarawak together, they're actually fiscally bigger than Malaya itself. So when you talk about campaigning in Sarawak, you talk about big, big money. Just as a very rough example, if you were to campaign in the rural interiors, unless you can hire a helicopter, you really cannot campaign in more than 1 or 2 longhouses a day. But with a helicopter, you can easily hop. You can easily hop from one longhouse to the other. And hiring a helicopter is an extremely expensive exercise. So therefore, GPS will have a distinct advantage because of this money. So basically for Sarawak, unless something major happens, I expect GPS will do very well again, except for the Chinese area. My take is that the Chinese area will stay with the DAP. One other thing that's constantly been talked about is that if GPS were to hold election sooner rather than later, will the voters punish GPS for what is called COVID-19 state election? Now, this happened in Sabah. What happened was that after the Sabah state election, they found that there were major breaks up of COVID-19. And many people put it to the fact that a lot of people moving around during the state election in Sabah, and that helped the spread of COVID-19. So many people are also arguing the same thing, that the GPS should not be going for an early state election because this may help the spread of COVID-19. So going forward, Sabah and Sarawak will be friendly to the Muhyiddin government for the foreseeable future until the next GE. So what does it mean in terms of the federal-state relations? On the ground itself, I don't think it means very much. It might mean additional development money for Sabah and Sarawak, but this money will not come through in the next budget. It might come through in the future through a thing called a special grants mechanism, but it definitely not come through in next year's budget because next year's budget is all about a recovery budget and the COVID-19 stuff. I think the real implication is that with these two states being friendly to the federal government, what is Muhyiddin going to do about the MA63 grievances? As many of you know, during the administration of Najib, in fact, Najib was the first one who decided to address this issue by proclaiming Malaysia Day, 16th of September, by giving a public holiday for the whole country, in order to recognize the role played by Sabah and Sarawak in the formation of the Federation of Malaysia. So Najib actually set up a federal level committee to deal with MA63. And of course, when he lost power in 2018, when Mahathir took over, Mahathir also established a federal cabinet committee. Now, it depends on who you speak to. According to the Perikatan National People, 21 issues were raised in this federal cabinet committee. And out of these 21 issues, 17 were resolved. Only 4 outstanding issues could not be resolved at the time when Pakatan Harapan fell in February this year. But this is likely to be disputed by the new minister in charge of Sabah Sarawak Affairs, Ong Kili. He has gone around telling people that he has never been happy with the work of this committee, and he doesn't believe that the so-called 21 issues, he doesn't believe that many of this has actually been resolved. They are not going to publish the report, even though the report of this committee is ready. My understanding is that they're not going to publish it. I think they're going to go back and relook at all the 21 issues. But the really, really contentious issues are basically the issues dealing with oil and gas. Basically, everybody wants to control the oil and gas resources found in Sabah and Sarawak and the offshore gas resources. The problem is if the federal government gives in to what Sarawak wants, which is let Sarawak owns the oil and gas resources, especially the offshore gas resources and the continental shelf. This means that Sabah, Kelantan, and Terengganu will expect to be treated in a similar manner. This essentially means that Petronas will be in big trouble because previously Petronas, because of the PDA 1974, Petronas was allowed to sign joint venture agreements with foreign oil companies. If these oil and gas resources are given back to the states, Petronas will no longer be able to do that. Far more importantly, if Petronas lose control of this oil and gas thing outside off the shore, this means that the federal government will lose a major portion of its development expenditure, because traditionally in the Malaysian federal budget, a major portion of its development expenditure actually consists of dividends or the payment made by the Petronas to the federal government. So I just want to quickly show you the list of the 17 items that Pakatan Harapan claimed that it was resolved during the time when they ran the Federal Cabinet Committee on MS63. The minister in charge, V.K. Liu, recently passed away, but he did mention to me that the report was ready and he was quite happy for the report to be made public. But as I mentioned, the new government has decided to put the report under the OSA and they're not going to release it. So, what are the options going forward for Muhyiddin, the new Prime Minister? I think he has several options on the table. The first one and the most obvious one is that he will follow Najib and Mahathir. He will set up another committee and try to delay the final settlement. And in fact, that's exactly what he's done. One of the things he did when he became the Prime Minister was that he announced that there will be a special council dealing with MS63. Obviously, he doesn't want to call it a Federal Cabinet Committee. That sounds too much like the previous government. And he has put a Sabah politician by the name of Max Ongkili, the president of Parti Bersatu Sabah, as the chair. And that committee has not met since March this year. And in fact, it will only hold its first meeting on the 30th of November at the end of this month. Basically, I think it will relook at the 21 issues brought up during the last Federal Cabinet Committee, and it will look at whether they can be implemented, because a lot of these things require change in rules and regulations, and some of the issues raised in the previous committee requires change in certain laws as well. So the idea is that if you delay final settlement, you set out a special council, the work itself will take at a minimum a year. In other words, you can push it to the back burner for a year. The second option available to Muhyiddin, of course, is that he can play nice with Sabah and Sarawak. And in fact, he has actually done this as well. He has appointed a minister dedicated just for Sabah and Sarawak affairs and parked the minister under the Prime Minister's office. As I mentioned earlier, Max Ongkili from Sabah is the minister, and the deputy is actually Hanifah from Sarawak. Hanifah is actually Taj Mahmud's daughter. So this gives you an idea of how closely linked the Sarawak governor is to the current politics. He has also tried to please the Sabah Sarawakians by appointing 11 ministers and deputy ministers from Sabah and Sarawak. And the big winner here back in March, of course, was GPS. GPS stepped out to make sure he came into power, and they were rewarded with 4 full cabinet positions, federal cabinet positions, including one of the senior ministers, one of the 4 senior ministers. So he has also agreed to most of what Sarawak wants when Sarawak asked for certain items back in February in order to support him. But the problem is that he will have problems trying to apply this to Sabah. So for example, the sales tax issue. I don't think he wants this to be applied to Sabah, but he may have to allow Petronas to apply his sales tax to Sabah as well. Going forward, because Sabah is now in the hands of Perikatan Nasional, he will probably appoint more Sabahans into GLC statutory boards in order to reward them. The third option is that Muhyiddin can move a constitution amendment to the federal constitution. Here we're talking about what they call the original wordings of the 1963 Malaysian constitution. So basically in the 1963 original constitution, Sabah and Sarawak was listed as separate states compared to the other 11 states in the Malay Peninsula. In 1976, there was a constitution amendment which lumped all the states together. So many people in Sabah and Sarawak are very unhappy about this, because they think that this is a downgrade in terms of a symbolic downgrade of Sabah and Sarawak as equal to all the other 11 Malayan states. They want Sabah and Sarawak again on a separate sentence, and they've been pushing very hard. And in fact, Pakatan Harapan tried to do this in April last year, but the move fell because GPS basically refused to go along with them. Basically, GPS argument is that if you want to amend, you amend it properly, and you must add the word in accordance with the Malaysia Agreement 1963. They want those 5 words into the new amendments. And because Pakatan Harapan was not willing to do it, they did not support it. So this is something that Muhyiddin may or may not do. My take is that he's unlikely to do that in the near term for a whole host of reasons. The fourth option is, of course, coming back to oil and gas. He can agree to give back all the oil and gas resources back to Sabah and Sarawak, along with the control of the continental shelf. This is something I don't think he would do either in the near or the long term. but he will allow Petros, the Sarawak State Oil Company, to operate within Sarawak. His fifth option is, of course, he can provide piecemeal autonomy to Sabah and Sarawak, deal with items one by one. For example, there's a big issue about transfer of teachers from Malaya to Sabah and Sarawak, because there's been a lot of allegations that some of the teachers, when they sent to the interiors, their priority is actually not to teach the indigenous children. Their priority is actually to convert them to Islam. So these are some of the issues that he can deal with easily within the bureaucracy. In terms of Sarawak, he can also return a lot of unused federal land. What happened was that the federal government throughout the 70s and 80s asked the Sarawak state government to give them a lot of land, supposedly for utilities and supposedly for things that the federal government will build. Many of these were left unbuilt, and the Sarawak government is actually quite angry. They want this land to be given back to the Sarawak government, so he can do that. In terms of Sabah, he can negotiate one-to-one on one of the special items with Sabah, which is the 40% refund of all the taxes collected in Sabah. This is a peaceful autonomy issue, and this is he will likely be doing this over the near term, because there is no political cost involved, and it is mostly bureaucratic in nature. And of course, finally, the option is to ignore the issue. But for me, this is not really an option, because he needs the MPs from Sabah and Sarawak to stay in power. So basically, the way to look at it is that from 2008 onwards, 2008, 2013 elections, general elections, the Federal Barisan Nasional were fallen from power if the MPs from Sabah and Sarawak, the old Sabah and Sarawak Barisan Nasional, did not support UMNO. UMNO were fallen from power in 2008. So currently, Sarawak has 18 MPs in Perikatan Nasional. Sabah has about 12. The figure is a bit wobbly because people are not sure about one or two or three MPs. People think that they might jump from left and right, and Sabah is famous for this cut-up politics. So that's the reason why I put a question mark. But the bottom line is that basically Sabah and Sarawak collectively can support Muhyiddin with about 30 MPs. And this is about 26% of his overall majority, which is about 112 to 114. But he faces a problem with the Sabah and Sarawak MPs in that he really cannot trust them, because these MPs can defect at any moment. In other words, they're always looking for who will give them a better deal. But the good news is that Muhyiddin will only need to keep the MPs from Sabah and Sarawak happy for a maximum of 2.5 years until the next general election, or until he calls an early general election. So coming back to MS63, is it really back to the future? I've always argued that the real issue is really not autonomy, even though people keep talking about autonomy on MS63, or the issue of recognition about the role played by North Borneo and Sarawak in the formation of the Federation of Malaysia. MS63 for me is really a symbol of the grievances. It's really not the cause. The real cause of the problem that we see in Sabah and Sarawak today is Malaya's insistence that Sabah and Sarawak follow the Malayan Ketuanan Melayu Islam political model if they want to integrate fully into the Federation of Malaysia. Now, this is very clear because Singapore could not take it. So that's the reason why they negotiated the exit in 1965. They refused to go along with Ketuanan Melayu. So they said, that, we're not going to have this sort of philosophy running country. We cannot accept it. And therefore, we go our separate ways. So what is the minimum for this sort of political system? The minimum for this sort of political system to work in Sabah and Sarawak is actually to stop the native or the indigenous non-Muslim population and the Chinese from coming together, from getting into power. That's basically it. It's as simple as that. So for example, they try to do this in Sabah through a thing called Project IC, which is to bring a lot of illegal migrants into Sabah, giving them Malaysian citizenship through Blue Malaysian IC. And the outcome is very clear today. So if you look at the number of seats in Sabah, say in the 60s and 70s, and the number of seats you have now at the state level, it is very clear that the Muslims have outright majority. So today, it is not possible to vote in a KDM government without Muslim support. If you want a Kadazan Dusun government in Sabah now, it has to be voted in with significant support from the Chinese community and the Muslim community. Back in the 60s, 70s, it was still possible to vote in Kadazan Dusun government on its own. In Sarawak, the federal government is intervening indirectly, especially strongly in 1970 and 1987, to stop the fall of a Melanau Muslim chief minister. And along the way, they've divided up the Dayaks, and also they divided up the Chinese, so that the Dayaks, the indigenous Dayaks, and the Chinese, Sarawak Chinese, can never capture power on their own. They will always require a Muslim partner. Okay. Now, if you look at the history of Sabah and Sarawak, say from 63, time of independence, up to the present day, you can make quite a good argument that Sabah has been more willing to go along with this Malayan political model, while Sarawak is slowly heading a separate way. So the upcoming Sarawak election is about which direction Sarawak will be traveling, whether they want to be closer to Putrajaya or they want to move in a more independent way in the federal system. If GPS wins, and I predict they will win if the elections are held in the very near term, then Sarawak over the short term will travel the opposite of the Ketuanan Melayu philosophy. But over the short term, Sabah will travel in a different direction. They'll travel closer towards Putrajaya, but at a much slower pace. So that's the reason why one of the big controversies you see in Sabah recently was that they allowed a non-elected member of PAS to become a member of the State Assembly. So my final word, when we talk about MS-63, we really should not be very surprised about what is happening in Sabah and Sarawak. When you look at it realistically, you can argue even many, many years ago that this was going to happen. You were going to have this problem facing the Federation in 2020. Essentially, North Borneo, Sabah and Sarawak had a very different history. They had a completely different language, completely different demography, completely different colonial experience. Sarawak was ruled by a private English family called the Brooks. Sabah was ruled most of the time by the North Borneo Charter Company. The Malays were always a minority in both states. And essentially, if you look back, there's really very little in common between the people of Sarawak and North Borneo with the people of Malaya. And back in 1963, it was very clear that even then, the indigenous leader of Sabah and Sarawak made it very clear that while they accept Islam is the religion of the Federation, they wanted religious freedom. And that's the reason why YB Lasimbang will talk about the Batu Sumpah, about the religious freedom thing. But again, all these are thrown out of the window because of this ideology of Ketuanan Melayu. So Sabah and Sarawak are actually very different. And if Putrajaya cannot accept this, and I made the argument that Mahathir really could not accept this, and that's the reason why he tried to change the demography of Sabah to Project IC, then there will always be political turbulence going forward. So using religion and ethnicity to try to assimilate Sabah and Sarawak with Malaya will probably not work in the long term. What we really need if we want to deal with this issue of MS-63 is really a new model for federal-state relations in the Federation of Malaysia. Thank you very much.
I think it's time to bring in YB Jannie Lasimbang to maybe respond to some of the points that James has raised, given her own recent experience in state government, as well as her much broader, longer experience working with the KDM communities, as well as the broader Sabah communities. Jannie, would you be able to engage with some of the points that I think James raises, including the apparent inevitable grief that's going to happen if Malaya tries to do what it's continuing to do for Sabah and Sarawak?
Thank you, Kean, and thanks also to Professor James. I think very spot on, I would say, and I'm glad that you have already spoken on many of the issues and the what we are going forward. In fact, I think you're very right, and if I want to speak candidly, we can't place our hopes on politicians, me included, of course. But we can obviously see that from what you said, PN, Barisan Nasional, PAS, they have really don't care. In fact, as you said, it might even be something that has been there or planned even not very nicely said. We see in different countries like Indonesia, you have the transmigration policies, but many people suspect, and really the allowing in Sabah, for example, all the migrants unchecked, that has always maybe something that we have said. Many citizens feel that it has been purposely done that way. And I think even if we look at Jeffrey Kitingan, Yong Tek Lee, who has spoken, as you said, for years, or the most vocal over the years about MA63. When I look at, I was shocked to see Perikatan Nasionals, that they are actually the deputy president, and they subscribe to the ideology of PN, which is Ketuhanan Melayu, Nasionalisme, Islam. And to me, that just shows that we can say all we want, but in the end, when it's expedient for us, you can really change that. And what you talk about being the real cause of what's happening, I think I really agree with you. So in my mind, then it is actually something, talking about control or money will never get us where we are. And I think more and more people, leaders, are talking about that. Our problem is that when we talk about genuine autonomy, is the word that has always been used, but my experience going over, being international, working with basically indigenous people, looking for autonomy and also independent, even in, for example, places like Northeast India, in autonomous regions in Philippines or Indonesia, also in Myanmar. These are all brings us back. Although my experience is more with indigenous peoples, and we talk very much for Sabah and Sarawak, because they are the majority, plus of course significant number of Chinese also, that it is eventually us trying to be in control of major decisions. We want to be that. And I think those, apart from making, being on control, looking at that, how we can be as a people that can make our decision, also having institutions that are strong, those that match our culture. I remember working for a long time trying to talk about the Universal Declaration on Rights of Indigenous, Universal Declaration on Human Rights with communities. They could not understand it, but when they came to talking about their land, their identity, we didn't have a problem explaining to them. So I think the same way, if you look at Sabah and Sarawak, we want to have something that matches the culture of who we are. And, and so these are the real issues that I hope can unite us, unite the people. And maybe we can try to take them as part of the uniting factor to make Sabah and Sarawak better, as you call it, back to the future. But we need to discuss it in a different, maybe in a different way, because, or try to move the discussion away from, as I say, always the funds, the control, 40% or the 20%, or, changes. Right now, even talking about more development funds, which I guess the dominates the discussion in the budget 2021 now. So I always thought that this will be a step towards achieving a better Sabah and Sarawak control and a better future for our people here. But obviously, we may have to do some really, thinking, and what Professor James have said, I think can bring us home to where our focus should be. Thank you.
Thanks, Jannie, for your contribution to that. Professor Chin, do you have sort of response to that before we also go to some questions which have come in through the Q&A button, which I encourage all of you watching, if you have questions to some of the very intriguing points made about nation and nationhood and Sabah and Sarawak that are coming through, to click the Q&A button at the bottom and type in your question, and we'll try and get through as many of them as we can. Professor Chin?
No, but I'll be very interested to get feedback from Trinity, who's sort of a youngish Sarawakians on the presentation I've just made.
Yes, Trinity?
Excellent points raised by Professor James. Really, really good research on that, and brought a different perspective to me. But as a youth representing my generation, the main concern we would basically have is just how well the state governments can really push for MA63 whilst maintaining a diplomatic relationship with the federal government. I don't really have much to say about the issues raised, because YB Jannie already kind of mentioned a few things that I had in mind too. I agree with both stances. And yeah, the main objective, the main issue that people my age would want to really, really see would just be how much we can restore autonomous power back to Sabah and Sarawak, and see what we can do with it, and how different things would be if we were given, all of the power back, or just what was promised and all that. Yeah.
Sorry. Thanks, Trinity. I think, Professor Chin, we could actually look at some of these questions that have now come up, including, I guess, some that echo my own as well in our previous discussions. This whole notion of whether the nation of Malaysia can hold together as an idea, given there appears to be only either a political or legal solution to this friction over MA63, as you have suggested in the conclusion of your remarks. And I'd be intrigued to also know what your views are about what the late previous Pakatan Harapan minister had mentioned regarding the 17 issues that PH government tried or had resolved.
Right. I think the question asked was whether the MA63 is a political issue or whether it's a legal issue, and therefore, what is the solution? Is it a legal solution or a political solution? The answer is that it is both. It is both a legal issue because there are certain parts of MA63 that are very clear. For example, the 40% thing. So that is clearly a issue. The thing about 10-year review on taxes and all that. So again, that is written in black and white. So it's a legal issue. But mostly it is a political issue in a sense that my argument is that the basically UMNO and the Malay establishment in Malaya is trying to export their model of politics into Sabah and Sarawak, and their model doesn't fit into Sabah and Sarawak. So in some ways, they're forcing the round thing into a square thing in Sabah and Sarawak, and this is where all the tension lies. So it is both a political dispute as well as a legal dispute. Now, the legal dispute can probably be handled quite clearly because most of it deals with money matters. So it's essentially whether Putrajaya wants to open up its purse and give more money to Sabah and Sarawak. But on the political issue, I suspect it will be a lot harder to deal with these issues. And also, a lot of these issues have multiple layers because a lot of it is actually steeped in history. So, for example, if you look at the Sarawak's contention that they have the right over the continental shelf, they're talking about a decision that was made before independence in 1963. In other words, decision that was taken by the colonial office that the continental shelf belongs to the state of Sarawak. their argument is that when Malaysia came to being, everything that was agreed prior to 63 also automatically became part of the Federation of Malaysia thing. So again, highly complex. It's both legal and political, but it is the political issues which I think is the roadblock to everything else. Because what happened is that the establishment in Kuala Lumpur or Putrajaya refuses to have a political settlement, because once you have the political settlements, all the legal settlements will be quite easily resolved, but they refuse to have a political settlement. So that's where the bottleneck is.
But this political settlement that you're talking about actually involves the broader issue or theme of this year, right? Which is the uncertain political settlement even in Putrajaya and the type of power sharing or coalition that can last.
Yes, because I think what has happened in Putrajaya now is that the whole Malay establishment, my argument is what happened in February this year was that the Malay establishment decided that this whole experiment with Pakatan Harapan, where they allowed the non-Malays to have a bit more political power, this has not worked. We have to go back to the hardline Ketuanan Melayu model. So that's the reason why if you look at the three core parties that formed the government at the end of February, all these parties were basically Malay Islamic parties. And they were very open about it. If you look at current budget, you can see that Bumi Empowerment was more than 11 billion ringgit allocated, while the allocations for Chinese community project, I think it was a lot less. And the Indians are also very angry that they got a lot less. So they don't even bother to hide this or try to cover this up. This is a Malay-centric government. The problem for me as a scholar of Sabah and Sarawak is that how do you proceed to implement this in Sabah and Sarawak where the political culture is totally different, right? And basically my argument is it's not going to work. Rather than resolve the issue, it's just simply going to create more problems. And on the other hand, at the federal level now, among the Malay parties themselves, they're also trying to create a new working model. Because what is really interesting compared to the previous model is that you have to remember the successful model they had under the so-called Barisan National government for the last 60 years, right? That model was a very, very simple model. If you were to break it down, essentially what you had was one Malay party that calls all the shots, and you can have as many other parties as possible representing the other races. So therefore, if you look at Barisan Nasional, you have one core Malay party, UMNO, 13 other component parties representing multiracial politics, Gerakan, representing the Chinese like MCA, all sorts of parties. But this model has broken down because the current government consists of 3 core Malay parties. So they don't know what to do. That's the reason why a lot of the CNA people are not actually saying that the only way out of this is to hold a general election to see which of the Malay parties can speak on behalf of the Malay community.
And that seems to be the underlying question that many of our attendees also seem to indicate in the questions that they are posing. The undercurrent apparently seems to be a demand for some sort of new governance model, a model that currently seems broken, doesn't work. It certainly doesn't work as far as we know, speaking to various corporate players in Malaysia who are very distressed about this. So
going forward in terms of, since this seminar is about Sabah and Sarawak, I've always made the argument that going forward, if you want to have long-term solution to the issues facing Sabah and Sarawak, is you really need a new model for federal-state relationship. The reasons why Putrajaya is so reluctant to deal with this issue because they're very worried that any special deals they do with Sabah and Sarawak, the Kelantanis and the Johorians will be knocking on their door. So that's the reason why they're very reluctant. They're not even willing to discuss a new model. A new model, actually, when you look at it politically, is actually quite a simple thing. It is not something very difficult. There are lots of constitutional lawyers. They try to make it, a lot of academics try to make it very difficult by bringing all sorts of other issues in. But if you look at the original Malaysian constitution, it was actually quite simple. You had the so-called 3 schedules: federal list, which is powers absolutely the federal government, state list, and concurrent list. So in fact, if you want a new federal model, you can either build in a new list, which is the fourth list that deals specifically with Sabah and Sarawak, or you modify the concurrent list. So there's actually not a difficult thing to do politically. But the problem is that the moment you bring in the legal scholars, it becomes very complicated.
I think there's a question here from our friend Dr. Joe Samad, who actually points out a very simple one, which I'm sure Jannie and even Trinity and yourself, Professor Chin, can certainly address. Why is it that Sabah and Sarawak can't seem to work together on the issues raised by the breaches in MA63?
Maybe I can come in a little bit first. Well, I think one of them is that the lack of understanding. We are really worlds apart, you know. The first thing of it is actually the understanding. I don't know how many of them really understood. I mean, for example, I would say the first, just coming in when I was in the previous government, trying to bring in the understanding about education and health. I mean, just on that, which is maybe more practical. And I thought after years of actually talking about issues of education, the gap between Sabah and Sarawak and Peninsula, as well as on health, how, you know, the experts have been giving the number of doctors to citizens. That's to me a very, very clear report, and not coming from anyone, but from the professions themselves. And yet, when it came to and we started that, and I understood the frustration of the two ministries, because I knew I worked with them very well, not just about, you know, overall, for example, what are the what kind of education curriculum there are, which is actually very important for us, so that it you know, it is more reflecting our culture, but only just those related to poor scholar dive, they call it, you know, really badly constructed or very old schools, and they can't even come to you know, an agreement or have the heart, I would say, to give more allocations for that. There was a big and huge discussion back and forth between the Ministry of the new Ministry of Education with the Federal Ministry, and I mean, they were starting to do that, you know, but still couldn't bridge that or didn't reach that. And when the new government came, PRS government came, they just removed the whole thing, saying, "Oh, we already have a federal ministry, so." We don't need a ministry that relates to or to deal with education. The same with health. We begin to see how, for example, in Sabah, how many midwives, for example, have been doing a lot of good things, and how important traditional medicine have been to communities, but they just overturned that with coming up with the complementary Medicine Act, not taking into consideration, for example, traditional practitioners, medical practitioners, the midwives, or traditional medicine, and how it can contribute. That we see Vietnam, for example, if you go to a hospital, you have option. You go to you know, traditional medicine, or you can go for you know, the mainstream or Western medicine, if you want to call it. There is a recognition, of course, of Chinese or even Malay traditional medicine, but not kadazan dusun. So these are all things that I think the lack, I call it a lack of understanding or care for our own voice, or what we need and how we see ourselves. Talking from a human rights perspective, you know, human rights based approach should start with what we already have, what we are strong in, but that has not come in. So that's, I think, is the start of the gap. What more you want to talk about, for example, culture and adat of communities. Look at the Orang Asli in Peninsular Malaysia. they don't care about them or don't even know their situation. So for Sabah and Sarawak, where we have majority of, or at least a sizable number of indigenous peoples here, yeah, the adat is very far. We've tried a lot to talk about how our how do you call it, our native court should be, how strong we want it to be, the, in a sense, the third pillar. But yet they're saying, the Islamic laws, for example, should and it's even included in the native court enactment that whatever is the, how do you call it, bidang kuasa, the jurisdiction of the Islamic law should not be dealt with by the native courts, whereas when in fact actually the native courts have been there way before the Sharia court. So these are, to me, again, indicating the worlds apart of where we are. So I don't really know whether we will ever get to a point where there's sufficient understanding. So because it starts with that. Once you have empathy and you have understanding of what Sabah and Sarawak people are thinking and needs are, then only you will be serious to give more. It's not just about, as I said, not just about development, but it's also the whole thinking, the whole institutions that we have, and also how we want to do things here. So I hope that something that I want to start with. Thank you.
Thanks, Jannie. Professor Chin, would you?
Sure. I'll answer the questions directly. Why Sabah and Sarawak cannot come together dealing with the issues? There's several reasons. A lot of it is tied into historical reasons. You have to remember the federal leadership was much closer to the chief minister in Sarawak compared to the chief minister in Sabah. So, for example, they had lots of problems in Sabah from 1985 until 95 when Sabah was under PBS. In fact, they forced through a thing called political recession. But they had excellent relationship with the Melanau leadership in Sarawak. But the key point why they can't get it together is because in Sabah, the ruling party is part of the federal ruling party. So all the calculation changed in 1990 when the federal BN moved into Sabah, and you have the Sabah UMNO coming up. So this sort of issue, from the federal perspective, they see Sabah as part of the other 11 states. So they never saw Sabah as a separate state. So Sarawak has always maintained a very high degree of autonomy. The previous chief minister of Sarawak negotiated a private deal with Mahathir Mohamad, where the federal BN was not allowed to set up shop in Sarawak. So that's the reason why in Sarawak you don't find MCA, you don't find UMNO, you don't find Gerakan. This is due to a private deal. So basically the bottom line is, for historical reasons, Sabah and Sarawak cannot get together and do a combined joint effort to confront Putrajaya on this issue. Now, having said that, it's also true that many of the issues faced by Sabah are very different from Sarawak. So, for example, a very simple example is that one of the key issues in Sabah since the 1980s, that what do you do with the PTI? Because there are all sorts of documents, and now they try to consolidate it into a single document. Even the idea of consolidating it in a single document, the first thing that comes to minds of most Sabahan is that this is the pathway to Blue IC. So that's the reason why there's a very, very strong blowback. So this issue has preoccupied Sabah for many years. Security issues between Tawi, the islands, and Mindanao is also preoccupied. All this issue does not have any bearings on the Sarawak side. So on the Sarawak side, there was sort of the unofficial policy under the previous chief minister is that, if we get involved with Sabahans, we just end up with too many issues. Let's just do a private deal with Mahathir on the Kuala Lumpur side. If there was a common issue, we'll come together. But if you expect us to combine together to confront Mahathir, the answer is no, because we've got a sort of a special relationship with Mahathir, and we want to maintain that special relationship.
Thanks, James. That seems to be a rather grim, if realistic, assessment going forward. I was just curious for all of you, including Trinity, who of course will be a fresh voter. Would many of these problems, you think, be resolved? The uncertainty in terms of the power arrangements that are still a bit fresh, they're not even a year old, from Putrajaya across to Kota Kinabalu and soon Kuching. Would it all be just easily resolved if we did have another federal general elections sooner rather than later? Maybe, James, you want to start with that?
Oh, I thought you were addressing Trinity.
Trinity
maybe let me rephrase the question for Trinity. I think Trinity has been very quiet because she's been thinking deeply, obviously. But I'm very curious to know, because I've done extensive surveys among the young people in Sabah and Sarawak. What I really want to know is that where do you actually see MA63 sit into the overall scheme of things? Because for the young people, right, when I did my surveys, right, it seems that while they all agree that MA63 is very important, while they all agree that Sabah and Sarawak should have more autonomy, right, they don't really care about the details. And this is to me, right, is a bit sad, because the reality in politics is always in the details. Like Trinity, you mentioned several times that you hope that GPS will carry through with its autonomy pledge and all that sort of thing. So I'm just wondering, what is the bottom line for you? Do you want Sarawak to integrate more fully into the Federation of Malaysia, follow more closely what's happening in Peninsular Malaysia, or you think Sarawak, like what GPS is saying, we should be going our own way?
I do agree that Sarawak should be going their own way based on like GPS. And I totally agree, and I understand your frustration about, when you mentioned you did the survey on the youth and their opinions on MA63, but they have very shallow knowledge on it. And part of the reason of that would probably be because even I myself have to admit this, is that we really don't do our research on things. We just follow a lot on the trend, like whatever's viral on Twitter. We know, MA63 is good for Sarawak and Sabah, we should just vote for it. But we don't really go much into the details. So I do really hope that, as a representation of my generation, we really try to change into that and see, and really do our own research, come up with our own critical thinking and opinions, because I've actually had a worry on that, and I'm glad you brought it up, because I was hoping I would comment on it somewhere during the seminar.
Thanks, Trinity. That's very helpful, and I guess it's good that there are people thinking about it. It seems to be an issue, though, where if you can't resolve it through these negotiations, and we seem to be in a bit of a block where everyone seems to still talk about a need for a new model, would having more political legitimacy in government through a more clear-cut result from general elections really be the solution, James?
No. When I talk about clear-cut results, I'm talking about clear-cut results among the major Malay players. Which one of them will be the Taiko? Which one of them will be first among equals? So every time there's a big political issue comes out, the last thing they'll think about is what do Sabahans or Sarawakians think? It's usually an afterthought. In fact, when the coup was launched in November last year, talking about replacing the Mahathir government, the Sarawak GPS numbers did not even come into calculation until late January. So they never thought about the Sarawak side until they realized they don't have enough numbers. Then they thought seriously about how should we bring in the numbers from Sabah and Sarawak. So you have to remember, in the old days when you were with UMNO, when you count the numbers, you also count the UMNO MPs as the assemblymen from Sabah as well. So you count them collectively together with Malaya. So that's the reason why I said the only reason why Sarawak has been able to sort of step back and do their own thing was because of the special deal that was done between the previous chief minister and the former prime minister Mahathir.
suppose you would be revealing too many secrets, Jannie, if you could tell us how DAP actually would try and survive general elections.
Well, I'm new in politics too. I mean, to be honest, there was a lot of hope when I joined. The reason I joined was really various other things, smaller than the bigger picture of Malaysia and national politics, really. But I've learned quite a lot. When we were, for example, Pakatan Harapan was talking about the manifesto, and I joined that. Sorry, I'm not answering your question directly, but I'm also reflecting during this webinar how there was a lot of hope when we talk about that the MA63 should go beyond. I mean, our discussion about Sabah Sarawak and being part of Malaysia, integrated into a more fair Malaysia will have to go beyond MA63, and there was a lot of hope. But obviously, the political, as you said, the instability and how it has, the experience we have over the last 2 years has really shown that it will be in the back burner as far as trying to clamor for the government. Even within DAP is something that we really talk about. The issue, who will be the next prime minister, become the biggest issue. Nothing discussed about what was in the manifesto and how Sabah and Sarawak, again, like James said, it will just be numbers that being counted. So when it comes to the next election, which I don't think it will happen, I don't feel it should happen now, especially now that the pandemic is there. But I do feel that this is something that will not be a big issue. Sabah and Sarawak and MA63 and so on will be something that will be a feature in this coming election. Is basically a fight for control, is a fight for which of the guards, the old guards, will continue to take control and so on. So in a way, it's a disappointment for new politicians like me. But I think that's why when you're in politics, I feel that one has to try and focus on a few issues that one can achieve. Yeah, that is my motto for now.
Thanks, Jannie. We only have a couple of minutes left, and I think we'll have to sort of wind this up. Before I whiz through the remaining sort of questions and themes that some of you have asked, thanks very much for putting them in. I just wanted to just quickly ask you, Jannie, given your experience in the region as well, would one of the solutions possibly be a decentralization of power, from the federal? Would that sort of help, you think, in state terms?
Yes, in fact, those are things, although it's discussed very much on the indigenous perspective, it's one of the things that we really believe in. Everywhere we go, especially looking at communities or indigenous communities who have been independent, or even they were, how do you call it, like you think about Northeast India, the Nagas, for example, they're still fighting for the fact that they have never been colonized, for example, in Myanmar, where they want to have a better federation. All this, I think, from my experience, they're not looking at so much. They have been also fighting all this time based on the party politics, the political space. But in the end, they realize that it is the education of people, how much they can be strong, be able to withstand, and be able to speak up for who they are. So, in fact, at the regional level, we've been talking about more programs about self-government, looking at how you're going to build your own institution. And we forget, even look at the lowest of our systems, which is everywhere. The JKK, the Ketua Kampung, they nowadays they're just following government. They're not thinking on their own, making plans for themselves. So even at that very level where you are all hoping that the government can come to your rescue or give you the development, we have become a community that doesn't know how to think for ourselves as a community of people with aspirations. So I think we need to, one of the things to achieve real self-government is really about thinking of your own future, your own state of affairs, and learning again to strengthen your institution. So that is, I think, at least indigenous organizations in Asia are looking at. And I think that can easily be brought for Sabah and Sarawak when it comes to thinking about our futures, how we look at our affairs, our resources, and only if we have our education is as wide as that on democracy and so on, then only we will be able to say we have a real autonomy, self-government in our own respective region. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jannie Lasimbang, for those thoughts. Good way to sort of help wind this up. We're winding up now. And thanks also to Trinity, Bungan, Tajang, who shared with us many of these insights of a fresh young voter and the new electorate that is coming up. I'd like to now hand it back to James Chin, Professor James Chin, to help close off this webinar with some final remarks. James?
Thank you very much, Kean. So final remarks is that first point is that what is happening in Sabah and Sarawak, the unhappiness has always been there for a very, very long time. The reason why it has floated to the surface now is simply because in the last 10 years, you have an explosion in social media. A lot of people were actually thinking about it for many years, but they could not find a platform that can express themselves and go with like-minded people. So that's the first point. Secondly, a lot of the things that we see today in Sabah and Sarawak were actually predicted back in the time of 1963 during the discussion about the formation of Malaysia. If you look at some of the private papers, even written by the British officials who were involved in the discussion, what was very clear was that the senior civil servants, expat civil servants in both Sabah and Sarawak were actually against the idea because they thought that the political philosophy in Malaya was so different, and a different history, different culture was so different to Sabah and Sarawak that it's just not going to work unless the political establishment in Malaya really understood that we have to form a new Malaysian identity rather than just carry on with this Malay identity, the one I'm talking about, Ketuanan Melayu or that sort of thing. And sure enough, what we find 60 years after the formation of federation, we have all these tensions that are slowly surfacing now. Going forward, I'm hopeful that whoever forms the new government in Malaysia, and I'm not trying to predict the downfall of the Muhyiddin government, I'm saying that there will be a new political establishment slowly being built in Malaysia. My hope is that they understand that Sabah and Sarawak are actually very different, and that there's really nothing wrong with Malaysia having a diversity of different systems. There's actually nothing wrong with Sarawak having its own little thing, Sabah having its own little thing, Kelantan is having their own little thing, Johor is having their thing. They should not come out with this idea that the Federation of Malaysia national identity must be Ketuanan Melayu or Bangsa Melayu, and that is all about federal power and centralization of power. If they maintain this attitude, then I suspect that the political turbulence that you find in Sabah and Sarawak will not only carry through, but in the coming years it will actually get more and more serious, especially in Sarawak. There's already signs on the ground that as more and more young people delve into their own history, they're getting more and more unhappy. So I'm basically arguing that, I'm hoping that whatever comes out of Putrajaya, we will have a more enlightened political leadership in the coming years.
Thanks very much, James. It's a great summation. Hopeful note. I guess we'll work towards that once we get rid of this year as well. Thanks everyone for attending this webinar on Sabah and Sarawak and the future of Malaysia as a nation, more or less. We will still be communicating over the ANU Malaysia Institute mailing list, so do sign up for that. It's within the webinar invite which you went through, and we'll keep you posted from that. On behalf of the ANU Malaysia Institute and JCI and the panelists, Professor James Chin, Jannie Lasimbang, and Trinity Bungan Tajang, thank you for your time and participating. Hopefully you managed to cover as much ground as your questions tried to prompt us with. Thanks again.